The evening had settled into a quiet stillness, the kind that made the house feel both peaceful and isolating. She sat alone in her living room, staring at the small pile of tasks that had suddenly become overwhelming. It wasn't the usual kind of exhaustion after a long day at work. This was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, an anxiety that something had gone wrong, something that she couldn't manage on her own. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran them over the papers scattered across the table. The problem she faced wasn't catastrophic in the traditional sense, but in that moment, it felt insurmountable. For hours, she had tried to solve it herself, pacing the room, muttering to herself, and even consulting her phone for possible solutions. Nothing worked. Frustration built inside her, a pressure that made her chest tighten and her thoughts spiral. The silence of the house only amplified her unease, each creak of the floorboard sounding unnaturally loud, each tick of the clock a reminder of time slipping away while she remained trapped in her predicament. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last light of the sun was fading. The neighborhood outside was calm, serene even, with a few distant sounds of life, cars passing, the faint bark of a dog, but inside, she felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She realized that trying to handle this alone was futile. She needed help even if it was just a temporary fix, just a hand to steady her and perhaps bring some clarity. Her thoughts immediately went to her neighbor. He was someone she had known casually for years, a friendly, approachable man who always greeted her with a smile when they passed each other in the hallway or the garden. She had never considered him someone she could rely on in a moment of crisis. Yet now, in her desperation, he seemed like the only option. The idea of calling him filled her with a mix of hope and unease. She didn't want to impose or appear needy, but the urgency of her situation overpowered her hesitation. After a moment of internal debate, she picked up her phone and dialed his number. The tone rang through her fingers, each second stretching painfully, until finally he answered. His voice was warm, casual, and unsuspecting, a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She explained her situation hesitantly at first, unsure how much to reveal. His response was immediate and reassuring. He offered to come over right away, and she felt a flicker of relief. At that moment, it seemed like a small weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As she waited for him to arrive, she tried to calm herself. She straightened the cushions on the couch, picked up the stray papers, and even wiped down the surfaces. Small, almost meaningless actions that gave her a sense of control amidst the chaos. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension lingered. She wondered if calling him had been a mistake. What if he judged her for needing help? What if things went wrong? The questions raced through her mind, unrelenting and sharp. When she heard the sound of footsteps outside her door, a mixture of relief and apprehension surged through her. The familiar knock echoed, and she opened the door to see him standing there, casual yet attentive. He carried a toolbox and wore a confident expression, a silent promise that he was ready to help. For a brief moment, the air between them was ordinary, friendly, a neighborly exchange that should have been comforting. But even in that first interaction, there was an unspoken tension. He asked questions, but his gaze lingered just a little too long, his smile a little too deliberate. She brushed off the feeling as paranoia, convincing herself that it was only the stress of her situation making her overly cautious. After all, he was here to help. That's all that mattered. They moved inside, and he immediately started assessing the situation. His presence was both reassuring and slightly disconcerting. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. She realized that by inviting him in, she had crossed an invisible threshold. From being alone with her problem to involving another person in her private world. It was a small, seemingly innocuous act, but it carried consequences she hadn't yet considered. As he worked, she watched him closely, analyzing his demeanor, trying to read his intentions. Part of her wanted to relax, to let go of the fear that had been gnawing at her all evening. Another part, however, remained alert, instinctively wary of the potential for something unexpected to happen. The night was just beginning, and though the situation seemed simple on the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter might change everything in ways she could not yet foresee. In that quiet, tension-filled living room, the first chapter of an unforeseen story was unfolding. A simple act of asking for help, A seemingly ordinary interaction between neighbors had the power to alter the course of the evening, and perhaps far more than she could imagine. The room was quiet except for the soft clinking of tools and the occasional rustle of papers as he moved around, examining the situation. At first, everything seemed ordinary. She felt a fleeting sense of relief watching him work, a comforting reassurance that her problem might soon be resolved. But beneath the surface, subtle signs began to appear, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her uneasy. The way he paused longer than necessary when picking up objects, the way his eyes occasionally flicked toward corners of the room she hadn't mentioned, created a subtle tension she couldn't ignore. She tried to focus on the task at hand, pretending that nothing was amiss. Her mind, however, was buzzing with questions. Was he really just a helpful neighbor? Or was there something more behind his attentiveness? The thought made her stomach tighten, yet she pushed it aside. She had called him because she needed help, and she had to trust him, at least. That was what she kept telling herself. As they worked side by side, she made a small mistake, dropping a key piece of the task she had been trying to manage on her own. He quickly reached out to pick it up, his hands brushing against hers in the process. The touch was fleeting, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her. She recoiled slightly, surprised by the intensity of the reaction she hadn't anticipated. In that moment, the ordinary interaction between neighbors began to feel charged with a subtle, unspoken tension. Then came the moment that changed everything. In her haste to correct another small error, she made a split-second decision, an impulsive choice that seemed minor at the time. Perhaps it was a dismissive comment, a gesture, or even leaving him alone for a brief second in a sensitive area of the house. Whatever it was, it triggered a chain reaction she could not have foreseen. His demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly at first. A pause, a narrowing of eyes, a flicker of surprise or perhaps calculation. By the time she realized something had changed, the night had taken a turn she could no longer control. He began to act differently, in ways that made her heart race. Questions that had been simmering beneath the surface of her mind began to demand attention. Was he testing her, watching her reactions, or had her action crossed an unspoken boundary? The ordinary task they had been working on together now seemed laden with hidden meaning. Every glance, every word exchanged, carried a weight that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. Despite her growing unease, she tried to maintain control, speaking casually and attempting to guide the interaction back to the original purpose, fixing the problem. But his responses were slightly off, too precise, too deliberate, as if he were measuring her reactions. She realized with a jolt that her single impulsive action had unveiled a side of him she had never known. The neighborly image she had constructed over years of casual encounters was beginning to crumble, replaced by someone more complex, someone whose intentions were not entirely clear. As the minutes passed, tension thickened in the room. She found herself second-guessing every decision, every movement. The simple act of leaning over a counter or handing him a tool suddenly felt loaded with significance. She noticed subtle cues, a change in his tone, a slight hesitation before responding. The way he observed her more carefully than before, it was as if the ordinary had transformed into a subtle game of perception and anticipation, where one wrong move could unravel everything. Her mind raced with scenarios, each more alarming than the last. Could this turn lead to conflict, to a breach of trust? Or perhaps it was the beginning of an unspoken connection, a dynamic neither of them had anticipated. The unpredictability of the situation made her pulse quicken. She realized that the night she had assumed would be simple, a request for help, and its resolution had now become a delicate balancing act between caution, intuition, and unspoken truths. At the same time, she felt a strange mixture of curiosity and fear. Every glance he cast her way, every casual question he asked, seemed to carry hidden layers of meaning. She began to notice small details she had never paid attention to before. The subtle expressions on his face, the slight shifts in posture, the way he moved around her space with a quiet confidence that bordered on unsettling. Her awareness sharpened. She became hyper-attuned to every movement, every word, trying to anticipate the next twist. By now, it was clear that her single impulsive act had set the stage for an entirely different dynamic. The evening had moved beyond the ordinary into something charged with tension, unpredictability, and hidden intentions. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that even the smallest decisions could have significant consequences. What she had initially perceived as a simple favor, a neighbor helping another, had become a catalyst for change, revealing layers of character, intention, and vulnerability she had not expected to confront. As the night stretched on, the problem they had initially set out to solve became almost secondary to the unfolding tension between them. Her thoughts oscillated between caution and intrigue, fear and curiosity. Every gesture, every word, seemed to carry the potential to reshape the trajectory of the night. And deep down, she knew that the consequences of this moment, of that impulsive decision, would extend far beyond the immediate task at hand. In that quiet, charged room, the ordinary act of asking for help had transformed into a night of suspense, revelation, and tension. A single choice, seemingly minor, had shifted everything. By the time they paused for a brief break, both were acutely aware that the night would not end as it had begun. Something had changed irrevocably, and neither of them could predict exactly how it would unfold. After the initial relief of having someone to help, the atmosphere in the house subtly shifted. At first, everything seemed routine. He moved around efficiently, assessing the problem she had called him for, and she felt a cautious sense of comfort watching him work. The familiar image of her neighbor as a helpful, trustworthy figure reassured her. But beneath that surface, tension quietly began to creep in. Small actions, slight hesitations, and a fleeting glance here and there suggested that this was not a simple, ordinary encounter. She tried to ignore the unease building inside her, focusing on organizing the tools and materials he had brought. Yet her instincts whispered warnings she could not completely silence. The way he observed her, the way he lingered over certain details, made her suddenly hyper-aware of every movement she made. Even a simple gesture, handing him a wrench or moving to another side of the room, felt charged with a subtle tension. She couldn't tell if she was imagining it, or if the dynamic between them had truly shifted. Then came the moment that would alter the course of the evening. In her nervousness, she made a small, seemingly insignificant decision, perhaps leaving a sensitive object unattended, making a careless remark, or stepping away from the area for just a moment. At that instant, his demeanor subtly changed. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had noticed something that confirmed a thought or suspicion. The shift was almost imperceptible, but she felt it immediately, a faint chill running down her spine. Something about his behavior suggested that he was no longer just a neighbor helping her. There was now a new layer, something unspoken that had emerged between them. She tried to focus on the task, speaking in casual tones to steer the interaction back to normalcy. But the ordinary rhythm of conversation had been interrupted. His responses carried an unfamiliar edge, and the way he glanced at her now seemed to carry hidden questions. Was he testing her? Was there a subtle judgment behind every smile or nod? Her mind raced, examining every detail of his behavior. The neighbor, she thought, she knew, was revealing complexity she had never anticipated. Her pulse quickened as she noticed subtle signs that his intentions might not be entirely transparent. A lingering glance, a question phrased unusually, or the way he handled objects in her home, everything seemed to have acquired a new significance. It was as if the small, impulsive action she had taken had opened a door she could no longer close, allowing attention to flow into the room that neither of them could ignore. Despite the growing unease, she felt a strange pull toward understanding him, deciphering the intentions behind his behavior. Each interaction became a delicate negotiation, every word and gesture layered with potential meaning. What had started as a simple favor, a neighbor assisting her, was evolving into a subtle game of perception and intuition. She realized, perhaps with a mix of fear and fascination, that this night would not unfold according to any script she had imagined. The problem they were attempting to solve together now felt secondary to the new dynamic unfolding in the room. Every small action, from moving an object to a fleeting touch, carried weight. The air was thick with unspoken communication, each aware of the other's heightened awareness. She found herself analyzing his every movement, interpreting the tiniest expressions, while he seemed equally attuned to her reactions. The evening had become a delicate dance of tension, curiosity, and caution. At one point, she attempted to regain some sense of control by steering the conversation toward neutral topics, trying to ease the charged atmosphere. But it became clear that the equilibrium had shifted. The ordinary familiarity between neighbors had transformed into a complex interplay of power, perception, and hidden intentions. The night was no longer simply about solving a problem. It had become an exploration of boundaries, trust, and the consequences of a single impulsive action. She also began to recognize an uncomfortable fascination growing within her. Each glance he gave, each subtle gesture carried layers she wanted to decode. The initial fear mixed with a strange curiosity. How far would this shift in dynamic go? How would it affect the relationship she had thought was merely casual? The unpredictability of the moment, the uncertainty of his intentions, created an electric tension that neither of them could ignore. By the time they paused briefly, both were silently aware that the night had diverged from any normal expectation. The problem she had initially called him to help with seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional and psychological currents now flowing between them. That small impulsive act, so minor she hadn't thought twice about it, had become the catalyst for an unfolding drama of tension, revelation, and anticipation. What had begun as a routine favor had now become a night charged with unpredictability. Every decision, every glance, every word carried potential consequences. The ordinary evening had transformed into a complex web of hidden intentions, subtle manipulations, and emotional vulnerability. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that the smallest actions could ripple outward in ways no one could foresee. By the time the pause ended, she knew that nothing about the night would be the same again.